Beneath the city of Dravenmoor, in a stone hall no map admitted existed, the auction had already begun. Masked nobles filled the rows, their faces hidden, their coin purses open. The air smelled of tallow smoke and old stone, and beneath it something colder, fear that had soaked into these walls for longer than anyone standing in them wanted to consider. Iron cages lined the far wall. Girls sat inside them, some silent, some weeping quietly enough not to draw attention, all of them watching the stage with the particular stillness of people who had learned that stillness sometimes bought a few extra minutes of safety. On the table beside the auctioneer sat a stack of purchase seals, wax already warmed, ready to be pressed into skin the moment a buyer signed his name. Cale Draven stood near the back of the hall, hood low over his face, a mask hiding features half this room would have recognized from coins, and banner struck in his own likeness. He was not here to bid. He was here to end this place. Royal guards were already stationed in the upper tunnels, positioned there before dusk, under cover of a supply inspection, waiting for his signal. He had planned to let the auction run only long enough to identify every buyer's face before sealing the exits. He had not planned on a girl being dragged onto the stage before his men were in position. For 3 months, reports had reached the throne of girls disappearing from villages, with no wolf, no pack, no one to claim them. Village elders had written letters that went unanswered by local lords, too comfortable to investigate their own borders. Cale had read every one of them twice, and tonight he intended to find out exactly how deep the rot went. He had never once connected those reports to his own emergency decree. The paperwork Varric operated under used the language of protection, not sale, dependent custody rather than ownership, and the illegal auctions themselves ran through a separate, unregistered network that never touched the lawful registry Cale's clerks were permitted to inspect. 2 ledgers, 2 systems, one man quietly moving girls between them whenever it suited him. He did not expect it to reach the crown itself. The auctioneer, a narrow man named Malrek, stepped onto the stage and raised his hand for silence. Behind him, a girl was dragged forward, wrists bound in a chain so black it seemed to swallow the torchlight around it. Ownership completes only when the purchase seal is signed and blood marked, Malrek announced, his voice carrying easily over the hushed room. Bidding alone secures nothing. He turned toward the girl, gesturing at her like she was livestock at a fair. Lot 17. Wolfless. Unclaimed. No registered name. No pack witness. Mira Ashvale did not cry out. She did not beg. She had learned, long ago, that begging only fed men like these, gave them one more reaction to sell alongside her. Instead, she did what she always did in rooms like this. She watched. She memorized the ring on the third bidder's hand, heavy silver with a house crest she didn't recognize yet. She counted the guards near the east exit, noted which ones looked bored and which ones looked ready. She noted the small iron door beneath the stage and the muffled sound of another girl crying behind it. Talia. She'd heard her voice 2 nights ago through the wall of their shared cell, singing something quiet and off-key to keep herself calm. Mira filed it all away, the way she filed away everything. Somewhere beneath her ruined dress, a small strip of metal held careful notches, places she'd been, routes she'd survived, a record only she could read. It was the one thing they hadn't managed to take from her, because they'd never thought to look for it, and because a girl who stopped keeping records was a girl who had stopped believing she might one day need them. The bidding rose quickly. Numbers were called from beneath masks, cold and clinical, as if the girl standing in chains were a piece of furniture rather than a person breathing in front of them, counting exits, memorizing faces, refusing in the only way still available to her to disappear entirely into the role they'd assigned her. Cale's voice cut through the room before he decided to let it. He named a sum no one in the hall could match, high enough that a ripple of surprise moved through the crowd, several masked heads turning toward the hooded figure who'd spoken. Malrek's eyes gleamed with the particular satisfaction of a man who had just secured the night's largest sale. He lifted the purchase seal from the table and extended it toward the hooded stranger, who had just won the highest bid of the night. "A fine choice," Malrek said. "Sign here, blood mark below, and she's yours before the candle burns another inch." Kale took the seal in one hand, studying it for a moment, the wax already softened by nearby torchlight. Then he tore it in half. The hall went silent in a way that felt almost violent, the kind of silence that follows a sound too large for the room to hold. "No purchase seal will carry my name," Kale said, pulling back his hood, letting the torchlight fall fully across a face half the room recognized instantly. "She is not mine. She is witness." Gasps rippled through the massed crowd. Chairs scraped against stone. Somewhere near the back, a noble bolted for the exit before guards could stop him, his mask slipping from his face as he shoved through the crowd. Malrek's composure cracked for just a moment before he forced it back into place. "Your Majesty," he began, "this is highly irregular." "Everything in this room is irregular," Kale said. "That's rather the point of my being here." Mira stared at the man now standing before her, uncertain whether this was rescue or simply a different kind of cage with better lighting. She had heard men promise freedom before. She had learned not to trust the sound of it until she'd tested its weight. Kale reached toward the black chain binding her wrists, intending only to break it. The moment his fingers touched the metal, it burned red, light spilling across both their skin, like something long buried finally waking. A mark bloomed across Mira's wrist. An identical mark bloomed across Kale's palm. The entire hall fell into stunned, frightened silence. Somewhere in the crowd, a masked figure raised a crossbow, aiming a silver bolt directly at Mira's chest. Kale moved before he consciously decided to, some older, wilder instinct surging up through his blood, and a shadow seemed to ripple around his shoulders for half a heartbeat. Low and feral, before he threw himself between Mira and the bolt. It grazed his arm instead of finding her heart. Chaos erupted. Malrek, seeing his auction collapsing around him, reached beneath the stage and pulled a lever hidden in the stone. A deep groan rolled through the tunnels beneath them. "He's collapsing the passage," Mira said, grabbing Kale's sleeve. "The ledger chamber is down there. So are the other girls." Kale's first instinct was fury, pure and burning, an urge to seal every exit and let no buyer leave this hall unpunished, to let his wolf settle old scores with every masked face still fumbling toward the doors. "Guards," he began. "Seal the—" Mira gripped his arm harder, hard enough to make him look at her instead of the fleeing crowd. "Don't call it saving me," she said, "if the girls after me are still being priced." Kale's jaw tightened, torn between two furies pulling him in opposite directions, both of them righteous. Only one of them useful in the next 60 seconds. Something in her voice broke through the rage, faster than reason could have. Kale turned his guards toward the collapsing tunnel instead of the fleeing crowd. They ran. Smoke and dust filled the narrow passage as stone ceiling groaned overhead. Mira led the way, memory carrying her faster than any map could have, counting turns she'd memorized weeks ago without ever expecting to use them, though fear made her cautious in a way that would cost them later. Guards followed close behind, torches sputtering against the thickening smoke, someone shouting for the girls still trapped in cages to hold on, that help was coming. She knew a second route out, one that ran alongside the main slave corridor, shorter, faster, but closer to where Malrek himself would likely flee. She didn't mention it. Not yet. Some old, hard-won instinct told her not to hand a stranger, even a bleeding one, every secret she carried, not after 3 years of learning exactly what happened to girls who trusted too quickly. By the time she finally pointed toward it, Malrek had already reached the ledger chamber ahead of them, and Flame was already climbing one corner of the record shelves, pages curling black at the edges, faster than anyone could hope to save them. They pulled girls from cages as the tunnel shook around them, coughing through smoke, hands raw from broken locks. Kale's guards working alongside Mira with the kind of urgency that left no room for hierarchy or hesitation. In the chaos, a young girl named Talia darted past a falling shelf, and snatched something small and metal from the floor near Malrek's abandoned coat, a fragment of a key, before anyone else noticed it had fallen at all. She said nothing about it yet. She simply closed her fist around it and kept running, some instinct telling her it mattered more than she yet understood. Malrek himself didn't make it past the smuggler's gate. Kale's guards, already stationed in the upper tunnels for the operation, caught him trying to slip out through the same exit he'd used a dozen times before to move girls unseen. He was in a royal cell before the last of the smoke had cleared from the ledger chamber. By the time they emerged into open air, half the ledger chamber had burned. What survived was scorched, incomplete, but not entirely gone. Pages saved more by luck than by any plan. Mira stood in the wreckage of the auction hall's collapsed entrance, breathing hard, chain still burning faintly on her wrist, and understood, with a cold and sinking certainty, that her silence in that tunnel had cost them evidence they couldn't easily replace. They brought the rescued girls to a royal safe house on the edge of the city, walls thick, guards loyal, healers already waiting with warm blankets and quiet hands. An old healer examined the chain, still fused to Mira's wrist, turning it gently under candlelight, careful not to touch the burned mark itself. "Both metal," she said finally, "bound with royal ash. I've only seen it's like in old crown vaults." She turned Mira's wrist gently toward the light. "It does two separate things, and you shouldn't confuse them. The mark on your wrist and his palm, that's mate bond recognition. Royal blood woke the chain the moment he touched it, because the bond was already there, waiting. That's not something either of you did. That's something the metal simply saw." She traced a second, fainter line etched deeper into the chain's surface. "These other marks are different. This metal keeps its own ledger, one oath at a time. Every hand that signed, blood sealed, or claimed you against your will leaves its print here, whether that hand belonged to a buyer, an auctioneer, or a man who signed a decree from a throne room and never looked twice at what it became. So Kale isn't marked because he claimed me," Mira said slowly. "No," the healer said. "He's marked because he's your bond. Those are different debts. The chain doesn't confuse them, and neither should you." She said nothing more. She didn't pretend to know everything the chain could do, only what it was made from, and Mira found herself grateful for the honesty of a woman willing to say, "I don't know," rather than invent an answer to fill the silence. Kale sat across the room, staring at the mark burned into his own palm, like it might rearrange itself into something less complicated if he looked at it long enough. 3 years ago," he said quietly, "there was a border crisis. Wolfless refugees flooding in with no pack to claim them. Winter was closing in, and half of them would have died in the open before spring. I signed an emergency decree granting Lord Varric authority over unclaimed wolfless dependents. I thought I was protecting people who had no one else." His jaw tightened. "I didn't read every clause. I trusted the men who drafted it. There was language allowing dependent custody to convert into labor ownership, if no pack witness came forward within a year. I signed my name to a door, and I never once checked what Varric built behind it." Mira watched him carefully, unwilling yet to let sympathy soften the anger still sitting heavy in her chest. A king's regret didn't undo 3 years of girls disappearing from villages too small to be missed. "Regret doesn't return what your signature helped take," she said. "No," Kale agreed. "It doesn't. That's why I don't intend to offer you regret. I intend to offer you the tools to undo it properly." "I did not buy you," he added. "I kept their crime in the open long enough to prove it." "Then prove it," Mira said, "by freeing more than me." She pulled the strip of metal from beneath her sleeve, showing him the notches she'd carved at every stop along her captivity. 3 lines for the smuggler's gate, a hook for the river route, a half moon for the auction cell. She hesitated, her thumb tracing over one notch longer than the others. "There's a 4th mark I misjudged. I thought it belonged to a guard working with the smugglers. It didn't. He was loyal. I nearly got an innocent man accused, maybe executed, because trusting the wrong shape once nearly got me killed. and after that, I stopped trusting anything I couldn't verify twice. Kale was quiet for a moment, absorbing what that kind of vigilance must have cost her, night after night, with no one to share the weight of it. It was understandable, he said finally. It was still dangerous, for you and for the man you misjudged. I'm not going to pretend it wasn't. But I'd rather we verify things together from here than have you carry that weight alone. I'm not apologizing, Mira said. I'm telling you so you understand why I hesitate before I hand you everything I know. It isn't about you. It's about what happens to me if I'm wrong again. She didn't say it as confession. She said it as warning, the same way she'd learned to read every room since the night she was taken. The royal archivist arrived by morning with the orphan registry, dust still clinging to its ancient binding, the leather cracked from decades of careful storage in a vault that had clearly not been opened often enough. He found the page quickly, hands trembling slightly as he turned the fragile paper. A name, once entered in careful, deliberate script, now crudely struck through with a single dark line. Mira Ashvale. Beside the name, a small notation in a different hand, hastier, less careful, as though written quickly and never meant to be read again. Reclassified. Unclaimed wolfless dependent. Lot pending. Kale stared at it long enough that his knuckles went white against the table's edge. Someone did this deliberately, he said. This isn't a clerical error. This is an erasure. The chain on Mira's wrist held something else too, a small half of a medallion, ancient and dormant, fused into the metal itself, its surface engraved with symbols worn nearly smooth by age. The healer studied it under stronger light, turning it carefully so the engravings caught the flame. Birth medallions like this were only issued to children born into the Luna succession line, she said. This one's dormant half suggests it was separated from its match a very long time ago. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were breaking apart. Kale went very still. I've seen that shape before, he said. Lady Seraphine wears a white moon brooch at every court ceremony. I always assumed it was simple decoration. I never once looked closely enough to see it was cut from something older. The archivist confirmed it within the hour, cross-referencing court inventory records, kept separately from the registry itself. The brooch had been catalogued generations ago as a Luna succession heirloom. Its decorative silver casing added only 2 decades back. The same season, the records showed that Mira's name had been struck from the orphan registry. Whoever recut it hid the original medallion half beneath that casing, the archivist said. Whether Lady Seraphine ever knew what she was wearing is a different question entirely. Mira turned the strip of metal over in her hands one more time, the notches catching candlelight, and thought about how close her entire history had come to disappearing along with her name, filed away and forgotten in a drawer no one thought worth opening. Word of what happened in the auction hall spread through the court by dawn, distorted and reshaped a dozen times before it reached the throne room itself, each retelling stranger than the last. Lord Varric was the first to speak when Kale brought the surviving girls before the council, his voice smooth and practiced in the particular way of a man accustomed to winning arguments through tone alone. Unregistered wolfless property has no legal standing before this court, Varric said. Whatever theatrics occurred in that auction hall changed nothing about her status, under the law you yourself signed, my king. A girl without a wolf has no pack, he continued, addressing the wider council now, gesturing toward Mira as though she were a hypothetical rather than a woman standing directly in front of him. A girl without a pack has no witness. And without a witness, she becomes whatever the law says she is. Several council members nodded, comfortable with a logic that asked nothing further of them. Seraphine stood beside him, the white moon brooch catching torchlight at her collarbone, her chin lifted with the particular confidence of someone who had never once doubted her own place in this room. A chain-marked auction girl cannot be permitted to stain the Luna line with rumor and spectacle, she said. This court owes her pity, perhaps, coin, if the king insists, but not standing. Mira met her eyes without flinching, feeling something steady settle inside her despite the exhaustion still aching in every part of her body. "No," Mira said. "A court that once bought people doesn't get to choose who's fit to become its Luna." A ripple of unease moved through the gathered nobles, murmurs rising and falling like wind through dry grass. Varric opened his mouth to press the point further, but Kael's raised hand silenced him before he could speak. Then a smaller voice rose from among the rescued girls, standing at the back of the chamber. The court's clerk had begun reading a preliminary list of victims, referring to each by the lot number assigned at auction, his tone flat and bureaucratic, as if reading inventory rather than names of living people. When he reached Talia's, she stepped forward before he could finish. "Lot 32 is what they priced," she said, voice shaking but clear enough to carry across the entire chamber. "Talia is who I am." She held out her closed fist and opened it, revealing the small key fragment she'd taken from the burning ledger chamber, its edges still faintly blackened by smoke. "There's a second chamber," she said. Malrek kept partial root records separate from the main ledger, in case the main chamber was ever found. "This opens it." The hall fell silent again, this time from something closer to shame, several council members shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Faced with a room full of witnesses no longer willing to be reduced to numbers, Kael made his first legal move. "By royal order," he said, voice carrying the full weight of the throne behind it, "I am restoring full legal standing to every wolfless witness present in this court, effective immediately, so that their testimony and evidence may be heard before the Bloodmoon Crown itself." Varric's protest died somewhere in his throat. "You cannot simply overturn precedent by decree," he managed finally. "I signed the decree that enabled this," Kael said. "I am suspending it now, effective immediately, pending full repeal." The Bloodmoon Crown sat at the heart of the ancient throne chamber, an artifact older than any king who'd worn it, said to answer only to truth laid honestly before it. Its surface, dark and unadorned, gave no hint of the power the old stories claimed it held. Mira walked into that chamber, with the chains still burning faintly against her wrist. Kael walked beside her, not behind her, not in front, close enough to matter, careful enough to let her lead. The chamber filled quickly, council members and witnesses alike, gathering along the stone benches, the weight of the moment settling over the room like a held breath. One by one, the evidence was laid before the crown, each piece placed with deliberate care on the stone platform beneath it. The royal chain itself, still humming faintly with old magic. The partial slave ledger recovered from the second chamber Talia's key had opened, its pages singed but legible. The orphan registry, Mira's struck name still visible beneath the ink, the page trembling slightly in the archivist's careful hands. Both halves of the birth medallion, drawn together for the first time in years, fitting against each other with a small, final click. Talia's testimony, and the testimony of every girl who had once been called a lot number instead of a name, each of them stepping forward in turn to speak plainly about what had been done to them. And finally, the oath marks etched into the chain itself, Malrek's signature among them, alongside the marks of buyers who had blood-sealed transfers. Deepest of all sat the faint trace of Varric's decree seal, burned into the metal not because he had ever touched the chain himself, but because the chain answered to royal authority, and his decree was the legal route every hand after him had used to claim her. Where his signature had granted the power, the chain had kept the receipt. The chain had not made her property, Kael said, voice carrying through the silent chamber. It had remembered every hand that tried to. Light gathered around the crown as it read what had been placed before it, verifying each mark, each signature, each sworn word, refusing nothing and inventing nothing, simply confirming what had already been laid honestly in front of it. The silence stretched long enough that several council members exchanged uneasy glances, uncertain whether the ancient artifact would answer at all. Then words formed in the air above the throne, ancient and absolute, visible to every person in the chamber. Mira Ashvale. Witness restored. A pause followed, heavy with the weight of every year her name had been erased, Every night she'd spent memorizing routes and faces, because no one else would remember her story if she didn't. Then, more quietly, the crown confirmed what the medallion halves had already proven. Luna bloodline recognized. Mira did not kneel. She did not weep with relief the way court legend might have expected of a girl finally restored to her rightful place. She turned instead to face the gathered nobles. "If the crown only remembers me when I stand before the throne," she said, "what about the girls who carry no mark at all?" Kale answered not with words but with action. Each order delivered clearly enough that the court scribes struggled to keep pace with their pens. He suspended the decree governing unclaimed wolfless dependents on the spot. Then he moved through the rest of it, one order at a time, each one carrying the same weight as the last. To protect people, he established a witness protection order for every rescued girl, ensuring none of them could be quietly retaliated against once the court's attention moved elsewhere. To preserve evidence, he sealed the auction site itself as a protected location and ordered the assets of every noble house connected to the auction frozen pending trial. To prosecute the network, he created a registry tribunal tasked with restoring struck names across every province, not just the capital, staffed by clerks answerable directly to the crown, rather than local lords. He opened formal trial proceedings against Varric, against Malrec, and against the Seraphine family's role in concealing the medallion's origin. Varric's composure finally cracked, the smooth authority in his voice giving way to something closer to panic. "If you arrest half this court," he snapped, "Dravenmoor will fall apart. You need men like me to keep this kingdom functioning. You always have." "If a throne needs someone in chains to stay standing," Mira said, "then it already fell a long time ago." The words landed heavier than any accusation could have, several council members lowering their eyes rather than meet the truth in them. The crown, still humming faintly with unspent verification, severed Varric's oath from the council chamber itself. The ancient magic, recognizing exactly the kind of betrayal it had been built to expose. He was led from the chamber by guards who, only a day earlier, would have answered to his authority without question. Seraphine's brooch cracked audibly in the sudden silence that followed, its decorative silver casing splitting along the seam the archivist had already identified. Beneath it, the original medallion half sat untouched, exactly as it had been cut from its match decades ago. When Mira's half was held against it, the two original pieces fit together perfectly, revealing the registry vault seal her family had quietly stripped away years before, the proof undeniable in front of the entire court. Seraphine did not scream or deny it. She simply stood very still. She had felt the pull of the chain the moment it burned in the auction hall days earlier, a wrongness in her own brooch she hadn't been able to name at the time. She had told herself it meant nothing. She had told herself the same thing every day since, choosing silence and the candidacy she'd been raised for, over a truth she'd had every chance to investigate and chose instead to bury. She lost her candidacy that same hour, escorted from the chamber not in chains, but in a silence that felt, to everyone watching, like its own kind of sentence. In the days that followed, nothing was destroyed carelessly. The original slave ledgers were not burned. They were sealed instead into a protected archive, available to every girl who wished to see her own record, hidden from anyone who did not. Each girl was given the choice of whether her own history would remain private or be entered as evidence for future trials. A small but deliberate act of returning control to hands it had been stolen from. What burned, publicly and deliberately, were the purchase seals themselves, stacks of blank wax and parchment reduced to ash in the palace courtyard while rescued girls watched, some of them crying, some of them simply staring at the flames with an expression closer to relief than grief. The lot tags followed, melted down one by one in a small forge set up specifically for the purpose, until nothing legible remained of the numbers that had once replaced their names. The auction dungeon was sealed permanently, transformed into a memorial and evidence site, rather than erased entirely, a reminder rather than a wound reopened. A place future generations could visit to understand exactly what had been allowed to happen beneath their city for far too long. A new shelter was built above ground instead, with windows, with names carved beside each door instead of numbers, built from entirely new stone rather than borrowed from anything that had once held a girl. Against her will, a fragment of the royal chain itself was melted down and cast into a small plaque above its entrance. Witness House. No girl enters unnamed. Weeks later, after the first trials had concluded, Kale found Mira standing near the new shelter's garden, watching workers plant something green where stone dust had once covered everything, the first real color the ground had seen in longer than anyone could remember. "Do you want to stay in Dravenmoor?" he asked. "Or do you want me to make the roads safe enough for you to leave?" He didn't ask her to stay because of the mark on her wrist. He didn't ask her to become anything for him at all. The question sat open between them, entirely hers to answer. Mira looked at him for a long moment, turning the question over the way she turned over everything, weighing it against every instinct that had kept her alive this long. "I'm staying," she said. "Not because of this mark. Because there's still work here neither of us has finished." Kale nodded, something easing in his shoulders that had nothing to do with sleep this time. Registry tribunals across the provinces began restoring names within the month, one struck line of ink at a time. Letters arriving daily from villages that had lost daughters to routes no one had thought to trace until now. When the first group of formerly nameless girls received their true names back, Mira stood beside Kale before the crown once more. This time not as a witness seeking standing, but as something the court had finally learned to recognize on its own terms. "My freedom didn't start when the crown called my name," she said. "It started the moment no girl was called a lot number anymore." She looked out at Talia and the others standing behind her, each of them holding papers bearing names no one could strike through again. "I didn't step out of chains and onto a throne to become a more expensive kind of property," Mira said. "I stayed so no one else would ever have to choose between surviving and being free." They had dragged her onto that auction stage as Lot 17. The crown restored her name, but Mira became Luna only after every girl standing behind her had one of her own.